Perseverance is the topic for today's episode, and we're taking it from Sunday, the 2nd of June 2013. Perseverance is a big thing in the Christian life, a very, very big thing. And, thinking about this topic, I've been thinking about the way in which people talk about the Christian life metaphorically. A lot of the time people will say things like, the Christian life is a marathon, not a sprint. And of course, I agree with that to a certain extent, but there's part of me that feels like even a marathon isn't a good description for what the Christian life is. And the reason why I say that is because, of course, what people are trying to hint at is that the Christian life is not supposed to be, over very quickly. It will take a long time. But both a sprint and a marathon have one purpose in mind, which is to make it to the finish line as quickly as possible. Of course, the marathon will take much, much longer, but that's still the goal. Make it to the finish line and make it there as quickly as possible. And I don't think that's what the Christian life is. I don't think the Christian life is solely about make it to heaven and make it to heaven as quickly as possible. That being the important part. Of course, our goal is to get to heaven. But is our goal to get to heaven as quickly as possible? Well, no, I don't think so. And I think if the goal was to get to heaven as quickly as possible, then the moment every Christian gives their life to Christ, God would have just whisked them away in that moment. But he doesn't do that. And I think that's evidence that that's not our goal. Our goal isn't to get to heaven as quickly as possible. Of course, it is to get to heaven, but the quickly as possible part, that's where I think that metaphor sort of falls apart. And I think we can better analogize the Christian life to a pilgrimage. Rather than a sprint or a marathon, we can think of the Christian life as a pilgrimage. Why do I say that? Well, because a pilgrimage, of course, has a destination in mind. And your goal is to get to that destination. But the journey to that destination in a pilgrimage is often just as important as getting to the destination itself. The journey of getting there is often just as important as getting there itself. And it's certainly not the aim of any pilgrimage to get to your destination as quickly as possible. There's something about the journey that is very important in a pilgrimage. And I think that's what the Christian life is like. There's something about our journey in returning back home to heaven that is very important and not to be trivialized and not to be thought of as let's just try and get there as quick as possible. I don't think that's the way God wants us to think about this Christian life, this life we have here on earth. I don't think he wants us to view this life here on earth as simply, something to be rushed through. I don't think he wants us to rush through it. I think there is a very specific purpose for each and every Christian here on earth. And that's why we remain here as long as we do until he comes back, until Christ comes back, or until he takes us home. I think he leaves us here for that particular purpose, and we can't trivialize that purpose and say our one and only aim is to get to heaven as quickly as possible. No, I don't think that's the case. I think we're on a pilgrimage. We are, of course, here with the sole destination of heaven. That is our goal. That is where we're heading. But the goal isn't to get there as quickly as possible because our journey, our pilgrimage there has many, many things to teach us. And I think one of the things it teaches us is perseverance, which is, the topic for today, perseverance. Romans chapter 5, verse 4, I think explains that quite nicely. And I'll read from verse 3 really. It says, "And not only that, but we also boast in our afflictions, knowing that affliction produces endurance, and endurance produces character, And character produces hope, and hope does not put us to shame, because God's love has been poured out into our hearts through the Holy Spirit that has been given to us. The part that I want to really focus on is right at the beginning of verse 4. And endurance produces character. You know, another word for endurance is perseverance. To keep going, to endure, to persevere. And Paul is saying that perseverance or endurance in this Christian life produces something. It produces character. It actually changes the person. Persevering in this Christian life actually changes the character of that person. You know, that's one of the reasons why God wants us here. He wants us here in this Christian life so that we can persevere, so that we can endure. And in that endurance, he changes us. In that endurance, he changes us. It would be very easy for God to whisk us away the moment we give our lives to Christ. Very easy. He can do it. But he leaves us here. And not only does he leave us here, he makes us endure and persevere through certain things. And the reason why he does that is because it makes us into something. It makes us into something. You know, it strikes me that when Christ encountered Andrew and Peter, and he was calling them to be his disciples, he said, "Follow me and I will make you into fishers of men." He didn't say, "I'll teach you how to fish men." He didn't say, "I'll show you how to fish men." He said, "I'll make you into something." That's the business that Christ is in. He's in the business of making people into things. And one of the ways he does that, one of the ways God does that, is by making us endure, making us persevere. Because that endurance, that perseverance produces character. It makes you into something. We can see this again in 2 Corinthians chapter 6. 2 Corinthians chapter 6 from verse 1 reads, "As we work together with him, we entreat you also not to accept the grace of God in vain. For he says, at an acceptable time I have listened to you, and on the day of salvation I have helped you. Look, now is the acceptable time. Look, now is the day of salvation. We are putting no obstacle in anyone's way, so that no fault may be found with our ministry. But as servants of God, we have commended ourselves in every way." This is very interesting. There's something going on here that Paul is describing. He's talking to this Corinthian church and he's telling them, you know, he's already given them some instructions and he's going to give them some more instructions. And he is, you know, backing himself up by saying, "Hey, look, me and the other guys that were around you, we were proper Christians. We commended ourselves. We put no obstacle in your way. We had certain rights that we could have grabbed a hold of, but we decided to let go of those rights just so that there would be absolutely nothing in the way of you and the gospel. We commended ourselves as Christians." And when in this chapter 6, he's going to give a long list of things that they did that were commending themselves as Christians. But look at the very first thing he says as an evidence of his of his Christianity. In verse 4, he says, "But as servants of God, we have commended ourselves in every way." First way that they've commended themselves, in great endurance. In great endurance. And he goes on to say a whole bunch of other things: afflictions, hardships, calamities, beatings, imprisonments, riots, labors, sleepless nights, hunger, so on and so forth, for multiple verses. But the first thing he says, the very, very first thing he says, "We have commended ourselves in every way in great endurance." That's the first way in which he's saying, look, this is an evidence of Christianity. This is an evidence of Christianity. Great endurance. Great endurance. The King James Version says, "But in all things approving ourselves as the ministers of God." So the way in which they were showing their stamp of approval as a minister of God, the very first thing that Paul gives as an evidence of God's stamp of approval of their ministry was great endurance, perseverance. It's the first thing he says. He says 20, 30, 40 different things. But the first thing he says, the first way in which God himself and them, through their behaviors, was commending and approving their ministry, their apostleship, their Christianity, was through great endurance. You know, this life, this Christian life, is a pilgrimage. The journey matters. The journey matters just as much as the destination. Where we have it in sight, heaven, that's our destination. But the journey of getting there matters so much. And in that journey, there is perseverance. In that journey, there is perseverance. And that perseverance actually approves and commends you as a Christian. It's actually one of the stamps of approval that God gives to Christians. Great perseverance. If they have that, if you can see that in a Christian, it's like a stamp of approval from God. Yes, this is a minister of mine. Look at the perseverance that shows you that that's a minister of mine. You know, Paul didn't say, this is the way in which we've commended ourselves to you by our great sermons. That's not what Paul said. This is the way in which we've commended ourselves to you by the wonderful tongues and interpretations and spiritual gift. No, that's not what he said. That's not what he said. I mean, I'm just reading the Bible. That's not what he said. He said that the way in which we're approved, the way in which we have commended ourselves to you, the way in which God has stamped us with his stamp of approval as his ministers, the first way is great endurance, perseverance. And I would say that's one of the main things to look for. If this person is a minister of God, the way in which that will be approved is by endurance. The way in which that will be approved is by endurance. If you're looking at a supposed minister of God and you can't see endurance, I'm not so sure whether there's approval there from God, not just from man, from God. If you can't see endurance, it's something to think about. Now, if perseverance and endurance is the way in which, or at least one of the first ways in which God marks his ministers with a stamp of approval, marks Christians as you know, Christians in general with a stamp of approval, how do you persevere? How do you persevere? And I think Paul explains that quite simply. In 2 Corinthians chapter 4, from verse 16, he says, so we do not lose heart. Or in other words, so we persevere. Even though our outer nature is wasting away, our inner nature is being renewed day by day. For our slight momentary affliction is producing for us an eternal weight of glory beyond all measure, because we look not at what can be seen, but at what cannot be seen. For what can be seen is temporary, but what cannot be seen is eternal. So he says some things in between the 2 points. At the beginning of verse 16, he says, so we do not lose heart. And then he says some stuff in verse 17. And then he gets back to the reason why they have not lost heart in verse 18. So I'm going to read it again, but I'm going to skip the stuff in the middle. And it says, so we do not lose heart because we look not at what can be seen, but at what cannot be seen. For what can be seen is temporary, but what cannot be seen is eternal. So Paul is saying, we persevere. And we persevere because we're looking at eternal things. We persevere, and we persevere because we're looking at eternal things. You see, this Christian life is a pilgrimage. When you're on a pilgrimage, even though the journey matters, you are looking at your destination. Even though the journey is so important, you're still focused on where you're going. Paul is saying, in this life, in this Christian life, we don't faint, we don't lose heart, we persevere, we endure. And he says, because we look not at what can be seen, but at what cannot be seen. He's looking at the destination. He's looking at the eternal destination. That's what is providing his perseverance. I think this Christian life is a pilgrimage. The journey really matters. The journey does something. It would be so easy for God to take us away. It would be so easy the moment we give our lives to Christ for him just to whisk us away like he did to Elijah or something. Just take us all away. But he doesn't. He leaves us here. And not only does he leave us here, but he gives us trials. He gives us trials and persecutions and all of these things. And he puts us in a position where we must persevere. Where we must. And he does that so that it changes us. Perseverance produces character. It changes the person. And how do you persevere? Well, Paul said it. Look to the eternal. So we do not lose heart, because we look not at what can be seen, but at what cannot be seen. Now, I think that from what Paul says, there are two really main things, two main eternal things to look at that provide perseverance. The first is judgment, righteous judgment, and the second is mercy. I think next week's episode, I'll talk about mercy, but I want to talk about judgment a little bit today. Looking at the righteous judgment of Christ is one of the ways in which to produce endurance in yourself. Hebrews chapter 10, verse 23, at least from verse 23, says, "Let us hold fast to the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who has promised is faithful. And let us consider how to provoke one another to love and good deeds, not neglecting to meet together as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day approaching. For if we willfully persist in sin, after having received the knowledge of the truth, there no longer remains a sacrifice for sins, but a fearful prospect of judgment and a fury of fire that will consume the adversaries." Wow. The writer of Hebrews is saying some stuff there. He's saying there are some things that we need to carry on doing in this Christian life. There are some things that we need to endure in. There are some things that we need to persevere in. He says, let us hold fast to the confession. The first thing that we need to persevere in. Let us consider how to provoke one another to love and good deeds. The second thing we need to persevere in. Not neglecting to meet together. The third thing that we need to persevere in, as is the habit of some. And he says, why? He says, what's the reason he gives for doing that? He says, for if we willfully persist in sin, if we don't do those things, after having received the knowledge of the truth, there no longer remains a sacrifice for sin, but what remains? A fearful prospect of judgment. He's saying persevere in those things, and this is what is going to stir up the perseverance. The judgment. The judgment. He says in verse 25, not neglecting to meet together, so persevere in that, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another. Then he says, and all the more as you see the day approaching. What day is he talking about? He's talking about the day of judgment. He's saying, have that day in mind, and let that day being in your mind be the stirring up of your perseverance in these good works that I'm telling you to do. Keep that day of judgment in your mind, and that will stir up the perseverance and the endurance you need to carry on doing these things I'm instructing you to do. It's one of the ways. We'll talk about mercy next week, but having that day of judgment in mind is one of the ways in which you can persevere. It's one of the things that stirs up perseverance because it's eternal. The judgment that will be wrought on that day is eternal judgment. It's not temporary. It's eternal. We'll go to Habakkuk chapter 3. We can also see a similar thing. These scriptures I'm taking, they were given in the daily devotional originally, this Hebrews chapter 10 and Habakkuk chapter 2. But I'm reading chapter 3 because I think it gives us a bit of a clearer image of some of the judgment that will be wrought by God. Habakkuk chapter 3 from verse 3 reads, God came from Teman, the Holy One from the Mount Paran. His glory covered the heavens, and the earth was full of his praise. The brightness was like the sun. Rays came forth from his hand, where his power lay hidden. Before him went pestilence, and plague followed close behind. He stopped and shook the earth. He looked and made the nations tremble. The eternal mountains were shattered along his ancient pathways. The everlasting hills sank low. I saw the tents of Cushan under affliction. The tent curtains of the land of Midian trembled. Was your wrath against the rivers, O Lord, or your angers against the rivers, or your rage against the seas when you drove your horses, your chariots to victory? You brandished your naked bow. Sated were the arrows of at your command. You split the earth with rivers. I'm going to skip a little bit to verse 16 because it shows the response of the prophet after seeing this vision. Verse 16, he says, I hear and I tremble within. My lips quiver at the sound. Rottenness enters into my bones, and my steps tremble beneath me. I wait quietly for the day of calamity to come upon the people who attack us. That was the response of the prophet after seeing this vision of this judgment that was going to come upon people. His enemies. The judgment that was going to come upon his enemies. And look at how it responded in him. Trembling, lips quivering. You know, our God is awesome. He's awesome. He's loving and he's kind and he's merciful. And he's also terrifying. He's also terrifying. You know, Jesus Christ is the lamb that was slain. And he's also the Lion of the tribe of Judah. He is open and loving and willing and accepting of everyone. And he is also the righteous judge. And nobody will escape judgment. Not one person. Not even one. It's something to keep in mind. And it stirs up perseverance in us if we keep it in mind. And you know, to further evidence that, I want to show us the perseverance that was produced in the prophet by this vision. Directly in this same chapter 3, Habakkuk chapter 3, we can see perseverance being produced in the prophet by this vision that he just had, this vision of the day of judgment. We can see the perseverance that it produces. Habakkuk chapter 3 from verse 17. And I pray really that all of us, with having judgment, eternal judgment in mind, can have the same perseverance that the prophet speaks of in this particular passage. From verse 17 it reads, though the fig tree does not blossom and no fruit is on the vines, though the produce of the olive fails and the fields yield no food, though the flock is cut off from the fold and there is no herd in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will exult in the God of my salvation. God the Lord is my strength. He makes my feet like the feet of a deer and makes me tread upon the heights. Godspeed.